Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Tonight, the air is still. The wind has ceased its whispering through the leaves, and the world seems to be holding its breath. It is a silence that feels heavy, ancient, and expectant. We are about to journey back to a time before the golden sun drove its chariot across a predictable sky, before the seasons turned in their rhythmic dance, and before the gods of Olympus sat upon their high thrones. We are going back to the very beginning, to the raw, churning roots of existence. Close your eyes. Let the modern world dissolve. Let the noise of the traffic, the hum of electricity, and the ticking of clocks fade away. Replace them with the deep, resonant groaning of the earth and the vast, suffocating weight of the sky. We are entering the age of the Titans. To understand the story of Cronos, the king who would eat his own future, we must first understand the prison into which he was born. In the cosmogony of the Greeks, as sung by the shepherd poet Hesiod on the misty slopes of Mount Helicon, reality did not begin with a bang, but with a yawn, chaos, a gaping void. And from this void emerged Gaia, the broad-breasted one, the earth itself. She was the foundation, the solid ground upon which all drama would eventually unfold. But she was lonely, and in her solitude, she spun from her own essence a partner equal to herself in magnitude. She created Uranus, the starry sky. Imagine that moment. The earth, looking up and seeing for the first time the infinite expanse of the heavens, studded with the swirling nebulae and the primal stars. It was a union of absolute elemental forces, the solid and the ethereal, the heavy and the weightless. Uranus was born to cover her on every side, to be an ever-present lover and a constant ceiling to the world. And cover her he did. But this was not a union of tenderness. It was a union of crushing dominance. In those early eons, the sky did not keep its distance. Uranus lay heavy upon Gaia. There was no space between the ground and the heavens for the air to circulate, for the trees to grow tall, or for light to penetrate the crevices of the world. It was a perpetual, suffocating embrace. Night after night, the sky pressed down upon the earth, driven by an insatiable, primal desire. And from this heaviness, life began to stir within the womb of the world. Gaia was fertile. She was the mother of all. But Uranus was a jealous and paranoid father. As his children were conceived, beings of immense power and terrifying aspect, he looked upon them not with love, but with loathing. He feared their strength. He feared that they would occupy the space he claimed for himself, and so he committed the first great crime in the history of the cosmos. He refused to let them be born. As each child began to rise from the depths of the earth, seeking the light, seeking to breathe, Uranus pushed them back. He shoved them deep into the secret dark hollows of Gaia. He imprisoned them within the very body of their mother. Imagine the horror of this existence. Inside the cavernous depths of the earth, in the hot, pressurized gloom of the subterranean world, the Titans grew. There was Oceanus, the deep swirling river that would eventually encircle the world. There was Coeus, the pillar of the north, and Creus, the ram. There was Hyperion, the high one, burning with the light that was denied to him. There was Iapetus, the piercer. And there were the sisters, Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys. They were gods, complete and powerful, yet they were trapped in a womb that had become a dungeon. They were crushed against one another, folded in the darkness, feeling the weight of their father pressing down from above, sealing the exit to the world. But they were the fortunate ones, for Gaia also bore other, more monstrous children. There were the Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Argus, the thunder, the lightning, and the bright one. Each had a single burning eye in the center of their forehead, master smiths who forged in the dark. And then, most terrifying of all, came the Hecatonchires, the 100-handers, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, beings of incomprehensible chaos, with 50 heads and 100 arms flailing in the cramped darkness. Uranus hated these children, with a passion that burned like a cold star. He found them vile, he found them ugly, and he rejoiced in his wicked work of keeping them suppressed. Deep within the crust of the planet, the pressure was building. Gaia was in agony. The physical pain of carrying 18 fully grown divine beings within her body was unbearable. She was stretched, torn, and compressed. The text of the Theogony tells us she groaned within. This was not just a sound of pain. It was the sound of tectonic plates shifting. It was the rumble of earthquakes. The mountains trembled with her distress, and the seas that pooled in her hollows foamed with her frustration. But Gaia was not merely a victim. She was the earth. She was the source of life, but also the source of hardness. She was resilient, and as her pain turned to rage, her mind began to work. She did not weep for mercy. She planned for revolution. In the suffocating dark, Gaia summoned a new element. She did not create wood or water or stone. She reached into her core and produced gray adamant. Depending on the translation and the interpretation of the scholars, this could be a type of steel, a diamond hard flint, or a mythical metal that no longer exists. It was the hardest substance in the creation. It was cold, sharp, and unbreakable. With this new material, she acted as the first smith. She shaped the metal. She hammered it not with tools, for there were no tools, but with her will and her tectonic force. She formed a great sickle, a harp. It was a curved blade, jagged and serrated like the teeth of a shark, designed for a single, brutal purpose, to reap. She waited for a moment when the sky shifted slightly, perhaps in the lull of his passion, and she spoke to her children in the dark. Her voice was the sound of grinding stones, low and resonant, echoing through the caverns of her own body. She showed them the gray adamant sickle. It gleamed in the darkness with a cruel, cold light, the only light they had ever seen. She laid out the plan. It was simple and horrific. The father who suppressed them, the father who despised them, must be punished. He had shamed them. He had devised deeds of unseemly wickedness, and so he must be stopped. Silence fell over the subterranean chamber. The Titans, powerful as they were paralyzed by fear. Uranus was the sky. He was everything above. He was vast, encompassing, and terrifyingly strong. To strike against him was to strike against the ceiling of reality. Oceanus swirled in nervous eddies. Hyperion dimmed his inner fire. The 100-handers huddled their 50 heads together in terror. None dared to meet their mother's gaze. None dared to reach for the jagged blade. None except one. From the back of the cavern, the youngest of the Titans stepped forward. He was not the largest, nor the flashiest, but he possessed a quality that the others lacked. The Greeks called him ankylomatus, crooked counseling, wily, devious. His mind did not move in straight lines like the sun. It moved in spirals, in traps, in shadows. This was Cronos. He looked at the fear in the eyes of his brothers. He looked at the agony on the face of his mother. And he looked at the sickle. He did not feel fear. He felt opportunity. He felt the cold, hard ambition that would define his entire existence. He realized that the throne of the cosmos was empty, save for a tyrant who ruled by weight alone. He took the sickle. The handle was rough, the blade heavy. It felt right in his hand. It felt like destiny. He spoke to his mother, his voice steady and bold. He promised her that he would not spare his father. He called Uranus a careless name, rejecting the bond of blood. He accepted the burden of the sin. Gaia's heart rejoiced. The tension within her shifted from pain to anticipation. She took her youngest son, the agent of her vengeance, and she hid him. She placed him in a specific ambush spot, a cleft in the earth, perhaps near the opening where the sky usually descended to lie with her. She instructed him on the blow. It had to be precise. It had to be final. And then they waited. The waiting must have been the longest part. Imagine sitting in the dark, gripping a blade of adamant, listening to the breathing of the world, waiting for the sun to set, waiting for the enemy to arrive. Cronos sat in the shadows, his muscles coiled, his mind sharp. He was about to commit the ultimate taboo. He was about to raise his hand against his progenitor. But in his mind, it was already done. He was already the king. Evening came. The light of the upper world, which the Titans could only sense as a dimming of the heat, faded. The great heaven came. Uranus descended. He brought the night with him. He longed for love, ignorant of the blade that waited in the dark. He spread himself out over the earth, embracing her fully, covering every mountain peak, every valley, every ocean. The weight was immense. The pressure was absolute. He was completely extended, completely vulnerable in his arrogance and his desire. This was the moment. From his hiding place, Cronos reached out with his left hand. This detail is specific and significant. In ancient thought, the left hand was often associated with the ill-omened, the sinister, the magical. He grasped his father. He grabbed the genitals of the sky, the source of all the generative power, the source of his own life, and the life of his imprisoned siblings. He held them fast in a grip that would not yield. Then, with his right hand, he swung the sickle. It was a long, jagged weapon, and he wielded it with the strength of a Titan. He did not hesitate. He did not tremble. He drove the saw-toothed blade through the divine flesh. The sound must have been indescribable. The scream of the sky tearing apart. The roar of Uranus as the pain shattered his cosmic dominance. The adamant blade sliced through muscle, sinew, and skin. It was a harvest. Cronos reaped the manhood of his father, as a farmer reaps a stalk of wheat. He cast the severed parts behind him. He threw them over his shoulder without looking, a gesture of contempt and dismissal. But the blood did not vanish. As the sky pulled away, howling in agony, recoiling from the earth for the first time in eons, The drops of blood rained down. These were not mortal drops. They were heavy, glowing, potent, divine essence. They fell upon Gaia. They soaked into the soil of the earth. And the earth, ever fertile, ever ready to receive, took them in. Even in this act of violence, creation continued. From these drops of blood falling on the soil, new beings were conceived. The Erinyes, the Furies, spirits of vengeance with snakes for hair and eyes that wept blood, born to punish crimes against the family. The giants, shining in their armor, holding long spears, beings of war and earth power. And the Melii, the nymphs of the ash tree, the trees from which men would later carve their spears. It is a grim irony that the act of separating the parents, the act of liberation, immediately spawned the agents of vengeance and war. The cycle of violence was planted in the very moment of freedom. But what of the severed flesh itself? It did not fall on the land. It fell into the surging sea. It drifted on the waves, a gruesome flotsam. But the salt water, mixing with the immortal foam of the sky's seed, began to churn. It began to bubble. A white foam spread around it, growing, evolving, taking shape. And from this sea foam, amidst the crashing waves, rose a figure of breathtaking beauty. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, born from an act of brutal hatred. She floated first to holy Cythera, and then to sea-girt Cyprus, and grass grew beneath her shapely feet as she walked ashore. Love and desire followed her. But back in the ambush, on the blood-soaked earth, Cronos did not look at the sea. He stood triumphant. Above him, the sky was retreating. Uranus, maimed and horrified, pulled away from Gaia. He rose high, fixing himself in the firmament, never to descend with that same crushing weight again. The space opened up. The air rushed in. The world took its first deep breath. The prison was broken. Cronos stood at the threshold of the cavern. He held the bloody sickle, the symbol of his victory. Behind him, his brothers and sisters began to emerge from the depths. They crawled out of the darkness, blinking in the starlight, stretching limbs that had been cramped for an eternity. They looked at Cronos not just as a brother, but as a savior, and as a ruler. However, as Uranus retreated into the upper atmosphere, he did not go silently. He hurled down a curse. He named his children Titans, the stretchers, the strainers, because they had stretched their power too far. They had presumed to strike at the order of things, and specifically to Cronos, he hissed a prophecy that would burrow into the young king's mind like a parasite and fester there for eons. "You have struck down your father," the sky rumbled, his voice now distant, but no less terrible. "But know this, you who are now king, the same fate awaits you. You will be overthrown by your own son. The cycle you have started will not end with you." Cronos likely sneered at the threat. He was young. He was invincible. He possessed the adamant sickle. He had defeated the greatest power in the universe. What need had he to fear children who did not even exist? He dismissed the voice of the sky. But the seed of paranoia had been planted. It was a tiny, cold seed, buried deep in his heart, right next to his ambition. For now, though, it was the time of triumph. Cronos helped his siblings out of the earth. He freed the Titans. he looked upon the world that was now his to shape. The sky was high and distant, a neutral canopy. The earth was free. The age of Uranus was over. Cronos ascended to the throne. He did not build a palace of gold, not yet. He established his seat of power on the high peaks, perhaps on Mount Othrys, the dark counterpoint to the future Olympus. He took the sickle, washed the blood from it, and kept it by his side. It was no longer a tool of harvest. It was the scepter of his dominion. He was the king of the world, the archon, the pillar, the timekeeper. But a king needs a queen, and a king needs a court. He looked to his sister, Rhea. She was the flow, the ease, the motherly aspect of the earth, just as Gaia was the foundational aspect. She looked at him with admiration, seeing the strength that had liberated them. They came together, not in the crushing, suffocating manner of their parents, but in a union of equals, of titans ruling over a fresh, untamed world. However, the first act of Cronos' reign was not one of benevolence. It was one of consolidation. He looked at the other children of Gaia who had been imprisoned with him. He looked at the Cyclopes with their singular, burning eyes and their skill with fire. He looked at the 100-handers with their monstrous, flailing limbs and their uncontrollable strength. He remembered how much his father had hated them. He remembered how ugly they were. And perhaps he realized that beings of such chaotic power were a threat to his own order. They were too strong. They were too unpredictable. And so the liberator became the jailer. Cronos did not free the monsters. He pushed them back. He threw the Cyclopes and the 100-handers down into Tartarus, the deepest, gloomiest part of the underworld, as far beneath the earth as the earth is beneath the sky. He slammed the bronze gates shut on them. He betrayed the very alliance that Gaia had hoped for. Gaia was displeased. She had forged the sickle to free all her children, not just the beautiful ones. She watched her son, the crooked counselor, repeat the sins of the father in a new form. She said nothing, but she remembered, and she waited. The earth always waits. With the monsters gone and the sky distant, the reign of the Titans truly began. This period would come to be known by later poets as the Golden Age. But do not let the name fool you into thinking it was a time of pure, joyous light. In the context of Cronos, the Golden Age was something stranger, something more eerie. It was a time of suspension. The Greeks believed that under Cronos, time did not flow as it does now. It was thick. It was heavy, like honey. There was no decay. There was no aging. People, if there were people yet, or the spirits that preceded them, lived for centuries without growing old. The earth gave up its fruit without tillage. There were no seasons, only a perpetual, bountiful spring. It sounds like paradise, but there is a shadow in a world that never changes. A world without struggle is a world without growth. Cronos, whose name would later be confused with Kronos, time, became the master of this stagnant perfection. He ruled over a world that was frozen in a moment of ripeness, a harvest that never rotted but was never consumed. He sat on his throne, the sickle across his knees, watching the silent, golden world he had claimed. He felt secure. He felt absolute. But in the silence of the night, when the stars of his maimed father wheeled overhead, he could hear the echo of the curse. Overthrown by your own son. He looked at Rhea, his queen. He knew that eventually they would have children. The natural order demanded it. And he knew, with the icy certainty of the adamant blade, that he would never allow those children to replace him. He had not crawled out of the belly of the earth to be pushed aside. He made a vow to himself, a vow darker than the one he made to Gaia. He would stop the cycle. He would devour the future to preserve the present. The Golden Age was about to turn red. The harvest god was getting hungry. And as the first stirrings of life grew in Rhea's womb, the king of the Titans opened his mouth, not to speak, but to prepare for a feast that would horrify the cosmos. The sickle had done its work. The sky was severed from the earth, and the great bleeding wound of the cosmos had begun to heal. The screams of Uranus had faded into the high, thin atmosphere, leaving behind a silence so profound that it seemed to possess a weight of its own. Cronos was now the undisputed master of the horizon. He sat upon the highest peak of Mount Othrys, the dark throne of the Titans, and looked out upon a world that was holding its breath in anticipation of his command. What followed was an era that poets and dreamers have yearned for ever since. They called it the Golden Age. When we hear that phrase today, we think of wealth, of glittering palaces, of a time of supreme cultural achievement. But the Golden Age of Cronos was not a civilization of gold. It was a biological state of existence. It was a time when the universe paused. Under the rule of the Titan King, the harsh, grinding gears of necessity stopped turning. The seasons, which mark the passage of time with the decay of autumn and the violence of winter, did not exist. There was only one long, endless, bountiful season. It was a perpetual spring, heavy with the scent of blossoming flowers and ripe fruit hanging on the same branch. The sun did not scorch, it warmed. The wind did not bite, it caressed. The earth, Gaia, liberated from the crushing weight of the sky, gave forth her bounty without being asked. This is the detail that Hesiod emphasizes in his works and days. The concept of automatos, automatic, spontaneous. The ground produced grain without the plow. The vines grew heavy with grapes without the pruning hook. The forests offered honey dripping from the hollows of oak trees. It was a world of aggressive, overwhelming abundance. And into this garden of static perfection, Cronos allowed a new race to emerge, the golden race of men. They were not men as we know ourselves, creatures of anxiety, labor, and mortality. They were beings of the earth, molded during this time of suspension. They lived in the shadow of the Titans, and they lived like gods. Their hearts were free from sorrow. They did not know the meaning of the word toil. They did not sweat. They did not strive. Imagine a life where the concept of tomorrow carries no weight because it is exactly the same as today. These golden men did not age. A man could live for hundreds of years, yet his skin remained as smooth and unwrinkled as a child's. His limbs did not weaken with time. They feasted constantly, sitting at tables laden with the earth's spontaneous gifts, beloved by the blessed gods. And when the end finally came for them, it was not the terrifying, gasping death of later ages. It was a sleep. They simply lay down in the tall, soft grass, closed their eyes, and their spirits slipped away into the ether, becoming the demons, the guardian spirits that would watch over later generations. It sounds like paradise. It sounds like the ultimate mercy. But look closer. Look at the face of Cronos as he watches over this flock of eternal youth. There is no love in his gaze. There is only a cold, possessive satisfaction. This golden age was not a gift of benevolence. It was a cage of order. Cronos was the archon of limit. By freezing the cycle of life and death, by removing the struggle, he had removed the potential for change. A world that does not struggle is a world that does not grow. It was a stagnation, a beautiful, amber-trapped fly of a world. The golden men were happy, yes, but they were also hollow. They created nothing, for they needed nothing. They learned nothing, for they suffered nothing. They were merely ornaments in the garden of the Titan, living testimonies to his absolute control over reality. This control was central to Cronos' identity. In later centuries, mystics and Orphic poets would confuse, or perhaps deliberately merge, his name with Cronos, the personification of time. They would depict him turning the wheel of the zodiac, the father of eons. But the Titan Cronos was not the dam against it. He was the force that sought to arrest the development of the cosmos at the precise moment of his own victory. He wanted the harvest to be eternal, never rotting, never eaten, just suspended in that moment of peak ripeness. He feared the flow, for the flow meant the future. And the future, as his father had prophesied, meant his doom. So he sat on Othrys, the great stillness radiating from him, but beneath the soles of his feet, deep within the rock of the earth, there was a vibration that marred his peace, a rhythmic, distant pounding. It was the heartbeat of his guilt. When Cronos had seized the sickle, he had done so with the tacit promise to liberate his mother, Gaia, from the tyranny of Uranus. And Gaia's grief had not just been for the Titans, it had been for all her children, especially the monstrous ones, the Cyclopes and the 100-handers. After the castration of the sky, when the cosmos was reshuffling its laws, these terrifying brothers had looked to Cronos. They had dragged their massive, misshapen bodies out of the gloom, blinking their singular eyes, waving their 100 hands, expecting the embrace of their brother. They expected the sunlight. But Cronos had looked at them with the same revulsion his father had felt. Perhaps it was worse than revulsion. Uranus had feared their ugliness. Cronos feared their power. The Cyclopes were smiths. They could forge weapons. The 100-handers were kinetic energy incarnate. They could shatter mountains. In a static, golden world, such chaotic variables could not be tolerated. And so, the liberator had turned traitor. Before the ink was dry on history, Cronos had herded his brothers back into the dark. He did not merely leave them in the caves of the earth. He bound them. He pushed them down into Tartarus, that misty, gloomy pit where the roots of the sea and the earth are tied. He commissioned a jailer. To ensure that his brothers would never threaten his golden stasis, he set a monster to watch over them. Campe, a she-dragon of nightmares, with the upper body of a woman, the lower body of a viper, and a waist girdled with the heads of wild beasts. She coiled around the bronze gates of Tartarus, a living lock to keep the chaos contained. Up on the surface, the golden men laughed and ate honey. Down in the dark, The Cyclopes hammered against the walls of the world, and the Hecatonchires howled in 100 voices. Cronos could hear them. To anyone else, it might have been the rumble of a distant storm or the settling of the mountains. But to him, it was a constant reminder of his betrayal. It was the sound of loose ends. He told himself it was necessary. Order required the suppression of the chaotic. The beautiful, the Titans, could not coexist with the monstrous. He was refining the cosmos, curating it. But Gaia, the broad-breasted mother, felt every blow against the gates of Tartarus. She felt the misery of her other children. Her gratitude toward Cronos began to cool. She had traded a sky tyrant for an earth tyrant. She did not raise an army against him. Gaia moved slowly in geologic time, but she withdrew her favor. She became silent, watchful, a brooding presence in the background of his reign. And in that silence, Cronos turned to the only being who could offer him solace, or perhaps the only being he felt he could control, his sister wife, Rhea. Rhea was a titaness of flow. Her name, deeply connected to the root word for river or ease, suggested movement, birth, and the unceasing current of generation. While Cronos was the stone that stopped the stream, Rhea was the water that sought to go around it. She was the mistress of the wild mountains, the friend of lions, the lady of the beat and the pulse. Their union was the central paradox of the age. The force of stoppage married the force of flow. At first, it was a union of majesty. They ruled as the king and queen of the Golden Age, two pillars holding up the sky that Uranus had vacated. But as the eons of the Golden Age stretched on, a tension began to build between them. It was unspoken, subtle, like a crack in a dam. Rhea desired life. Not the static, unchanging life of the golden men, who were little more than animated clay, but true life, dynamic, messy, growing, aging life. She desired children. It was her nature. She was a mother goddess, yet her womb remained empty by the decree of her husband's will. But the biology of the gods cannot be suppressed forever. Just as the earth had given forth fruit without the plow, Rhea eventually conceived. The news should have been a cause for celebration across the cosmos. The king and queen were to have an heir. The golden men, if they had the capacity for complex thought, might have raised their cups of nectar in honor of the prince or princess. But when Cronos realized that his wife was with child, he did not feel joy. He felt a cold, sharp shock of recognition. The prophecy. You will be overthrown by your own son. The words of Uranus came rushing back from the depths of his memory. For centuries, he had successfully ignored them, drowning them out with the silence of his perfect world. He had convinced himself that he had stopped time, and therefore he had stopped destiny. But a child is the very embodiment of time. A child grows, a child learns, a child replaces. A child is a living clock that ticks down the moments of the parent's decline. Cronos looked at Rhea's swelling belly, and he did not see a son or a daughter. He saw an assassin. He saw a usurper. He saw the end of the Golden Age. Panic began to set in. It was a slow, creeping dread that chilled the air on Mount Othrys. The paranoia that had driven his father to push the children back into the earth now took a different shape in the mind of the son. Uranus had tried to prevent birth. Cronos knew that birth was inevitable. The flow of Rhea could not be stopped. So he had to deal with the result. He could not imprison them in the earth like his father. Gaia would not allow it again, and the Cyclopes were already filling the prisons of Tartarus. He needed a new prison, a prison that was close, a prison that was inescapable, a prison that was part of his own essence. He sat on his throne, brooding, his dark brows knit together. He watched the golden men below, playing in the meadows, oblivious to the storm gathering in the mind of their creator. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had wielded the sickle. They were strong. They were capable of grasping, of holding, of crushing. And then the thought came to him. It was monstrous. It was unthinkable. But to a mind governed by the absolute need for control, it was logical. If the children were destined to take his power, he would take their power first. He would reabsorb them. He would make them part of himself. He would turn his own body into the dungeon of the gods. Rhea approached her time. She was radiant, filled with the hope that this new life would soften the hard heart of her husband. She prepared the birthing linens. She dreamed of a daughter, a little goddess of the hearth, perhaps, who would bring warmth to the cold heights of Othrys. She did not see the shadow standing in the doorway. She did not see the hunger in the eyes of the king. The golden age was ending. The season of the harvest was over. The season of the devouring was about to begin. The silence of the world was about to be broken by the cry of a newborn, and the answering, terrible sound of a father swallowing his own legacy. The golden age, for all its honeyed abundance and deathless ease, was built upon a fault line. It was a paradise suspended over a pit of paranoia. On the peak of Mount Othrys, the wind began to change. It no longer carried the scent of eternal spring. It carried the metallic tang of anxiety. The king of the Titans, Cronos, sat upon his throne of black obsidian, his hand resting perpetually near the handle of the adamant sickle. He was the master of all he surveyed, yet he was a slave to a single sentence spoken by the starry heavens. You will be overthrown by your own son. It is a terrible thing for a god to fear the future. For a mortal, the future is a distant, misty concept, a land one might never reach. But for an immortal, the future is inevitable. It is a waiting room. Cronos knew, with the deep, grinding certainty of the earth itself, that time was not on his side. He was the Titan who had frozen the cosmos in a moment of perfection, but he could feel the edges of that perfection fraying. The catalyst for this unraveling was life itself. Rhea, his sister and queen, was the embodiment of the flow that Cronos sought to dam. She was fertile. Her very presence caused the earth to bloom and the animals to multiply. It was impossible for her to remain barren, and so the cycle of conception began. The first child grew within her. It was a time of joy for the mother, who felt the spark of a new divinity kindling in her womb. She walked the forests of Othrys, whispering to the unborn life, dreaming of the day she would hold a daughter or a son in her arms. She imagined a family that would fill the silent halls of the Titan palace with laughter and light. But Cronos watched her with the cold, unblinking eyes of a serpent. He did not see a child. He saw a tick mark on a cosmic tally. He saw a rival. He remembered the strength of his own arm when he held the sickle against Uranus. He remembered the feeling of the blade slicing through divine flesh. He knew, intimately, what a son could do to a father. And he resolved, with a logic that was as brutal as it was simple, that no son of his would ever have the chance to lift a hand against him. The day of the first birth arrived. Rhea retreated to her birthing chamber, attended perhaps by the nymphs or the titanesses, her sisters. The labor was the labor of a goddess, earth-shaking, profound, a shifting of energies. And from this labor, the first of the Olympians was born. It was a girl, Hestia. She was not a warrior, she was not a storm. Even as a newborn, Hestia radiated a sense of absolute, centered peace. She was the concept of the hearth, the fixed point around which a home is built. She was the warmth of the fire that cooks the meal and keeps the darkness at bay. She was the most gentle of all the gods, the one who would later resign her seat on Olympus to keep the peace. Rhea held her daughter, awash in the fierce, protective love of a mother. She cleaned the babe, wrapped her in swaddling clothes woven from the finest wool of the golden sheep, and prepared to present her to the father. She hoped, perhaps, that the sight of such innocence, such quiet perfection, would melt the icy resolve of the king. Cronos entered the chamber. He was vast, his presence filling the room like a thunderhead. He did not smile. He did not reach out a finger to stroke the cheek of the infant. He demanded the child. Rhea hesitated. She looked into his eyes and saw the abyss. But he was the king. His word was the law of gravity. Trembling, she handed the bundle to him. Cronos looked down at Hestia. He saw her potential. He saw the stability she represented. If she grew, she would anchor a new order, a home that was not his. He opened his mouth. It was not the mouth of a man. It was the maw of the earth. It was a cavernous opening that smelled of ancient soil, of roots, of the deep, dark places where things are buried. He did not bite. To bite would be to kill, and these children were immortal. They could not be killed by physical trauma. Instead, he swallowed. He placed the swaddled infant Hestia into his mouth and gulped her down whole. Imagine the horror of that moment, the violation of the most sacred bond in nature. The father, the protector, becoming the consumer. Hestia slid down the gullet of the Titan, descending from the light of the world into the acid darkness of his stomach. Rhea screamed. It was a sound that shattered the peace of the golden age. She clawed at his chest, beating her fists against his skin, which was as hard as the mountain stone. But Cronos stood unmoved. He felt the child settle in his belly. He felt the threat contained. He looked at his wife with a terrifying calmness and told her it was necessary. Order had to be maintained. The cycle had to be broken. This was the beginning of the Great Devouring. It established a pattern that would repeat with sickening regularity 5 times. The Golden Age continued on the surface. The sun shone, the men feasted. But in the house of the king, a reign of terror had begun. Rhea became a factory of grief. She was trapped in a cycle of pregnancy and loss, a conveyor belt feeding the hunger of her husband. The second child was born, another daughter, Demeter. She was the goddess of the grain, the spirit of the harvest, the force that makes the corn grow tall and the orchards heavy with fruit. She was the very essence of the abundance that Cronos claimed to rule. By all logic, she should have been his favorite. She was the sustainer of life. But Cronos saw her power. He saw that if she controlled the food, she controlled the people. If she controlled the growth, She controlled the cycles of nature, the very cycles he wished to freeze. He could not allow a rival power of fertility to exist. So, when Rhea presented the second child, weeping and begging for mercy, Cronos took her. He swallowed the harvest goddess. He took the grain into the silo of his own body. Demeter joined Hestia in the darkness. Two sisters, trapped in the living dungeon of their father, huddled together in a place where no sun would ever shine to make the crops grow. Then came the third, Hera, the golden sandaled one. Even as an infant, she possessed a regal dignity, a piercing gaze that demanded respect. She was the queen of heaven in miniature. She represented sovereignty, marriage, the binding oaths that hold society together. Cronos recognized this immediately. He was the king. There could be no queen but the one he controlled. Hera represented a challenge to his authority, a rival monarch who might one day question his decrees. He could not tolerate a peer. He swallowed her. He ate the queen. Hera descended into the abyss, joining her sisters. Now there were three: the hearth, the harvest, and the crown, all consumed by the insatiable need for control. The horror of Rhea was absolute. She was a titaness, a being of immense power, yet she found herself paralyzed by the tyranny of her husband. She watched her belly swell with each new pregnancy, not with hope, but with dread. She knew she was incubating a meal for a monster. She tried to hide. She tried to plead. But Cronos was always there, watching, waiting, counting the months. And then, the gender of the children changed. The stakes were raised. The fourth child was a son, Hades, the unseen one, the future lord of the dead. He was born with the silence of the grave clinging to him, a solemn, dark-eyed child who did not cry. He was the master of the underground, the rightful heir to the spaces beneath the earth. When Cronos looked at Hades, he felt a flicker of the old fear. This boy was dark. This boy was like the earth. This boy was a mirror of Cronos's own somber nature. If anyone could understand the depths, it was this child. And because he could understand them, he could master them. Cronos swallowed him. He ate the afterlife. He ate the concept of death. Hades was sent down to a darkness that was not his own kingdom, but a prison of flesh. He was trapped in the stomach of the king, a place of timeless suspension. Finally, the fifth child, Poseidon, the earth shaker, the lord of the deep, the blue-maned god of the sea. He was born kicking and screaming, a storm in human form. His eyes were the color of the turbulent ocean. His cry was the roar of the breaking wave. He was raw power, kinetic energy, the force that shatters rocks and drowns continents. Cronos hated him instantly. This was the chaos he had tried to banish when he locked away the 100-handers. This was the unbridled fury of nature. Poseidon was a battering ram that could knock down the walls of Othrys. Rhea fought for this one. Some legends say she tried to hide him in a flock of sheep, but Cronos sniffed him out. He tore the child from her arms. He opened his mouth wider than ever before, for Poseidon was a storm that did not want to be contained. He swallowed the sea. He ate the ocean. Now, 5 gods were inside him: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. We must pause here to consider the nature of this imprisonment. It is easy to think of this as simple cannibalism, a grotesque fairy tale. But in the mythological consciousness, it is something far more profound. Cronos was not digesting his children. They were immortal. They could not be dissolved by acid or assimilated into his flesh. They remained alive, fully conscious, growing and maturing within the timeless void of his belly. The stomach of Cronos became a reversed womb, a place where life was held in stasis, unable to be born into the world, unable to die, unable to act. It was the ultimate expression of his Golden Age philosophy, a perfect, unchanging collection of power, hoarded inside the king. He had become a walking pantheon. He contained the hearth, the earth, the crown, the underworld, and the sea. He felt heavy. He felt invincible. He believed that by consuming the parts, he had become the whole. But he had forgotten the mother. Rhea was shattered. She wandered the halls of Othrys like a ghost, her hair torn, her robes stained with the tears of 5 losses. She looked at the bed where she had conceived them, and she cursed it. She looked at the husband she had once loved, the liberator, and she saw only a jailer worse than Uranus. Uranus had merely pushed the children back. Cronos had imprisoned them within himself, making their liberation impossible without his own destruction. Grief, when it is deep enough, turns into something else. It hardens. It crystallizes into a cold, sharp rage. It becomes adamant. Rhea felt the stirrings of life again. The 6th child. She knew, with the instinct of a goddess, that this one was different. This was not just another child. This was the culmination. This was the storm that had been gathering on the horizon for eons. This was the youngest, the one who would possess the power of all the others combined. She felt the kick of the unborn babe, and it felt like a thunderbolt striking her from the inside. She could not let this one die. She could not let this one be eaten. The line had to be drawn. The cycle had to be broken, not by stopping it, but by accelerating it. But what could she do? Cronos was all-seeing. His paranoia was a net that covered the entire mountain. He knew she was pregnant. He was counting the days. He was already whetting his appetite for the 6th course. In her desperation, Rhea did something she had not done since the beginning of the world. She went back to the source. She left the high peaks of Othrys and went down to the roots of the land. She called upon her parents. She called upon Gaia and Uranus. It was a strange council. The Earth Mother, who had armed Cronos against his father. The starry sky, who had cursed Cronos for his betrayal. And Rhea, the grieving daughter caught in the middle. She stood before them, weeping. She asked for a plan. She asked for vengeance. She asked for a way to save her last child, to raise him as a plague against his father. Gaia listened. She remembered the Cyclopes and the 100-handers rotting in Tartarus. She remembered Cronos' betrayal of her trust. The earth does not forgive easily. She looked at Rhea's belly and saw the destiny that was written there. "There is a way," Gaia whispered, her voice the rustle of leaves in an ancient forest. "But it requires deception. It requires a separation. You cannot birth this child here, under the gaze of the king. You must go to the hidden places. You must go to the rich land of Crete. Crete, the Island of Secrets, the island that stands apart from the mainland, surrounded by the wine-dark sea, and Uranus, the distant sky, nodded his assent. He confirmed the prophecy he had spoken eons ago. The sun is coming. The usurper is here. Rhea listened to the counsel of the ancients. A plan began to form. It was a dangerous plan, a plan that relied on a trick so audacious that only a desperate mother could conceive it. It involved a stone, a simple, rough stone from the earth. She returned to Othrys, but her demeanor had changed. She no longer wept. She no longer pleaded. She walked with a new purpose, masking her rebellion under a veil of submission. She told Cronos that her time was near. She played the part of the dutiful wife. But in the dead of night, when the moon of Phoebe was hidden behind the clouds, Rhea began her preparations. She would not lose this one. She would not feed the beast. The sixth child was Zeus, and for him the world would be torn apart. The Great Devouring had reached its limit. The stomach of the king was full, but his appetite was his weakness. He thought he had eaten the threat. He did not know that the threat was about to be smuggled out right under his nose, carried on the night wind across the sea to a cave where the destiny of the Olympians would finally begin. The silence of the Golden Age was about to be shattered by the clashing of shields. The stagnation was over. The war of the gods was incubating in the darkness of a Cretan cavern. The stomach of the king was a graveyard of potential. 5 gods lay in the dark, conscious but paralyzed, floating in the timeless bile of their father. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. They were the pillars of the universe, yet they were reduced to mere heaviness in the gut of a titan. Cronos sat on his throne, his belly distended with divinity, believing he had solved the riddle of fate. He had eaten the future. He had paused the clock. But he had underestimated the one force that can rival the survival instinct of a king, the desperation of a mother. Rhea was done weeping. The tears she had shed for her first 5 children had dried, leaving behind a residue of cold, hard resolve. She was a titaness of the earth, daughter of the solid ground, and she possessed a resilience that Cronos, in his sky-high arrogance, had forgotten. She carried the 6th child, the Stormbringer, beneath her heart, and every movement of the babe, every kick and turn, was a reminder that this life was too vibrant, too loud, to be silenced by digestion. She had received her instructions from the Ancient Ones, Gaia and Uranus. The plan was set. It was a gamble of cosmic proportions, a heist that required her to steal the air of the cosmos right from under the nose of the jailer. The time of birth drew near. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of Mount Othrys became suffocating to Rhea. She felt the gaze of Cronos on her constantly, a gaze that was not tender, but hungry. He was watching her waistline. He was counting the moons. He was waiting for the moment of delivery so he could complete his set of swallowed gods. Rhea knew she could not birth the child in the palace. The screams of labor would alert him. The cry of the newborn, which she sensed would be louder than any that came before, would seal the infant's doom. She needed distance. She needed the shadows. One night, when the sky was choked with thick clouds, perhaps sent by Uranus to aid his daughter, Rhea slipped away. She did not flee in a chariot of fire that would draw the eye. She moved with the quiet fluidity of a shadow. She descended the slopes of Othrys, leaving the realm of the Golden Age behind, and crossed the wine-dark sea. Her destination was Crete. Crete is not just an island in Greek mythology. It is a world apart. It is a place of ancient magic, of bulls and labyrinths, of mountains that scrape the sky and caves that plunge into the underworld. It is the land where the laws of the mainland do not always apply. She arrived at the district of Lyctos, a rich and fertile land. But she did not stop at the cities of men. She climbed. She ascended the slopes of Mount Dictae, or, in some traditions, Mount Ida. The mountains share the honor of the god's cradle. The terrain here was wild, jagged, and hostile to intruders. It was a fortress of stone built by nature. She found the cave, the Dictaean Cave. Imagine the entrance, a dark slit in the gray rock, hidden by ivy and ancient scrub. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of wet limestone and deep earth. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like the teeth of the earth itself, dripping water into silent black pools. It was a womb within a womb, a sanctuary hidden from the eyes of the Titan king. Here, in the deepest recess of the cavern, Rhea finally let go. She surrendered to the agony of birth. She gripped the stone pillars of the cave. She cried out, her voice mingling with the wind that howled outside the entrance. And the earth received the child. Zeus was born. He did not emerge quietly. The myths tell us he was born shining. He was born with a presence that instantly filled the cavern. He was the Dios, the Bright One, the Lord of the sky in human form. Even as an infant, his skin crackled with a static charge. His eyes held the blue-white intensity of lightning. He was the breaker of chains, the end of the stagnation. Gaia, the grandmother, was there in spirit, if not in form. She took the child from Rhea's exhausted arms. She embraced her grandson, the one she had prophesied would avenge her. The earth of the cave floor seemed to soften to cradle him. But the danger was at its peak. Cronos was far away on Othrys, but his hearing was sharp, and his suspicion was a living thing. If the child cried, if the Storm Lord let out a wail of hunger or triumph, the sound might carry on the wind. Cronos would know. He would come, and he would tear the mountain apart to find his meal. Rhea looked at her newborn son, her heart breaking. She knew she could not stay. She could not raise him. To stay would be to lead the wolf to the lamb. She had to leave him in the darkness of the cave, entrusted to the care of the earth. But who would protect him? Who would hide the noise of a god? Gaia had prepared guardians. From the earth sprang the Curetes, or the Corybantes. These were not gods, nor were they men. They were earth-born spirits, demons of the wild. They were clad in bronze armor, with crested helmets and heavy shields. They were fierce, rhythmic, and devoted. Rhea gave them a command, "Dance!" It was not a dance of joy. It was a dance of noise. It was the Perikios, the war dance. The Curetes formed a circle around the infant Zeus. They began to stomp their feet, shaking the floor of the cave. They drew their swords and struck them against their bronze shields. Clang, boom, clang, boom. They shouted. They chanted wild, guttural songs. They leaped into the air, their armor rattling, their weapons clashing with a deafening, rhythmic violence. The purpose was simple: to create a wall of sound, to create a sonic shield that would drown out the crying of the infant god. If Zeus whimpered, the Curetes clashed harder. If he wailed, they screamed louder. They became the living insulation of the cave, turning the nursery into a cacophony of war, so that the silence of Cronos' golden age would not be disturbed by the truth. Rhea watched them for a moment, ensuring the boy was safe behind the wall of bronze. Then, she did the hardest thing a mother can do. She turned her back on her child. She had to return to Othrys. She had to complete the deception. Cronos was waiting for a baby, and he would not be satisfied until he swallowed one. She flew back across the sea, her body aching, her heart empty, yet filled with a terrifying hope. She arrived at the palace of the Titans just as the dawn was breaking, or would have broken had the sun been allowed to move. She entered the great hall. Cronos was there. He rose from his throne, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He looked at her flat belly. He looked at the bundle she carried in her arms. "You have delivered," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of hunger. "Give me the boy." Rhea held the bundle close to her chest. She had prepared it with agonizing care. She had gone to the rocky fields of the earth and found a stone, the omphalos, the navel stone. It was a large, smooth rock, heavy and cold. It was roughly the size of a swaddled infant. She had wrapped it in the finest linens, layer upon layer of soft wool, hiding the gray granite completely. She held it as if it were flesh and blood. She rocked it. She wept over it. Her tears were real, for they were for the danger she was in and the children she had already lost. She approached the throne. Her hands trembled. This was the moment. If Cronos touched the child, if he pulled back the blanket to check the face, if he sensed the lack of a heartbeat, they were all doomed. He would kill her. He would find Zeus. The rebellion would end before it began. "Here is your son," Rhea whispered, her voice choking. "Here is the heir you fear so much." She held out the stone. Cronos looked at the bundle. He did not look at Rhea's face. He was too focused on the threat. His paranoia had a blind spot. He was so convinced of his own absolute power, so used to the obedience of the cosmos, that he did not imagine he could be tricked by something as simple as a rock. He saw the shape of a baby. He smelled the milk on the linens. That was enough. He did not take the bundle in his hands to cuddle it. He did not peel back the cloth to count the fingers. He opened his mouth, that terrible, cavernous maw that had already consumed 5 deities. Rhea thrust the stone into his mouth. Cronos swallowed. He gulped it down with a single, massive contraction of his throat. The stone, heavy and hard, slid down his gullet. It crashed into his stomach, landing amidst the squirming, living forms of Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. For a moment, there was silence. Rhea held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She waited for the look of realization. She waited for the rage. But Cronos simply patted his stomach. He felt the weight. The stone was heavy, perhaps heavier than a child. But Zeus was destined to be the greatest of gods, so surely he would be heavy. The child did not move, but perhaps he was sleeping. Or perhaps he had been crushed by the fear of his father. Cronos smiled. It was a smile of supreme, arrogant relief. "It is done," he declared. "The prophecy is broken. the circle is closed. I am the king, and I remain the king." He sat back on his throne, the unshakable one, unaware that he was now carrying the instrument of his own mockery in his gut. He had swallowed a rock and called it a god. He had eaten the earth's decoy. Rhea bowed, hiding the flash of triumph in her eyes. She retreated from the hall, feigning sorrow, but inside she was singing. She had done it. She had blinded the all-seeing. Far away, in the Dictaean Cave, the real child was safe. The Curetes clashed their shields. The goat nymph Amalthea approached the infant Zeus, offering her udder. The great eagle brought him nectar. The bees brought him honey. Zeus began to grow, and he did not grow like a mortal child. In the rich atmosphere of the cave, fed on the milk of a divine beast and the ambrosia of the earth, he grew with terrifying speed. His limbs lengthened, his muscles hardened. The intelligence in his eyes sharpened, from the vague awareness of infancy to the focused, strategic brilliance of a king. He was growing up in the dark, just as his father had done, but unlike his father, who had stewed in hatred and fear. Zeus was growing up in freedom. He was growing up with the wild sounds of the Curetes in his ears, learning the rhythm of war. He was learning that power is not about sitting on a throne and swallowing your problems. Power is about action. Power is about lightning. Back on Othrys, the Golden Age continued its slow, suffocating march. Cronos grew sluggish. The stone in his belly sat heavy, an indigestible lump that weighed him down. He slept more often now, lulled into a false sense of security. He did not hear the whispers of Gaia in the wind. He did not feel the shifting of allegiance in the cosmos. He did not know that his time, the time he tried so hard to stop, was running out. The deception at Lyctos was successful. The seed of the rebellion had been planted, watered, and hidden. Now, it just had to ripen. Rhea visited the cave in secret, watching her son transform. She saw the resemblance to Cronos, the same dark power, the same commanding presence. But she saw something else, too. She saw justice. She saw a ruler who would not rule by devouring, but by distributing. She told him the story. She told him of his sisters and brothers trapped in the living prison. She told him of the cruelty of the grandfather, Uranus, and the tyranny of the father, Cronos. She handed him the legacy of vengeance. Zeus listened. He stroked the rough coat of Amalthea, the goat. He looked at the bronze shields of the Curetes, and he made a vow. He would not just defeat his father. He would humiliate him. He would make him disgorge the past. He would empty the prison. But Zeus was not a fool. He knew that Cronos was a titan of immense strength. The adamant sickle was still sharp. A direct assault by a young, untested god against the king of the world would be suicide. Zeus needed an advantage. He needed allies. He needed a weapon that was brighter and hotter than the gray adamant. And most of all, he needed to get inside his father's defenses. The stage was set for the next act of the drama. The cave could no longer hold the boy. The storm god was ready to leave the nursery. He was ready to claim his birthright. But first, he needed to make his father sick. The great emetic was being brewed in the mind of the goddess Metis, the wisest of all, whom Zeus would soon seek out. The stone that went down was about to come up, and it would bring the rest of the pantheon with it. The silence of the Golden Age was fracturing. The first rumble of thunder was heard over the peaks of Crete, and on his obsidian throne, Cronos shifted uneasily, wondering why his stomach had begun to ache. The infancy of a god is a fleeting thing. In the Dictaean Cave, time moved differently than it did in the stagnant court of Cronos. While the Titan king sat frozen in his paranoid amber, Zeus grew with the ferocity of a wildfire. He drank the rich milk of Amalthea, absorbing the wild strength of the beast. He ate the honey of the sacred bees, tasting the sweetness of the earth. He listened to the clashing shields of the Curetes, and the rhythm of war seeped into his bones. But strength alone would not be enough to dethrone Cronos. Cronos was the archon of the cosmos. He possessed the adamant sickle. He had the weight of eons behind him. To defeat him, Zeus needed more than muscle. He needed a mind. He needed a strategy that was sharper than flint. When he reached maturity, a young god of breathtaking power, his beard beginning to darken, his shoulders broad enough to carry the sky, he left the cave. He bid farewell to the nymphs and the demons who had raised him. He stepped out of the shadows of Crete and into the wider world. But he did not march straight to Mount Othrys. He went first to the edge of the world, to the stream of Oceanus, seeking the daughter of the primal waters. He sought Metis. Metis was a titaness of the elder generation, a daughter of Oceanus and Tethys. Her name meant wisdom, but not the wisdom of books or laws. It meant cunning. It meant craft. It meant the ability to find a way where there is no way. She was the goddess of the trick, the plan, the complex solution. Zeus found her by the gray waters of the world river. She looked at him with eyes that shifted like the tides. She saw his raw power, his unrefined lightning, and she knew him. She knew he was the solution to the stagnation of Cronos. Zeus laid his dilemma before her. "My father is a fortress," he said. "He holds my brothers and sisters inside his own body. I cannot cut them out, for the blade might harm them. I cannot beat them out, for his skin is impenetrable. How do I besiege a fortress that is a living god?" Metis smiled. It was a dangerous smile. She did not offer him a sword. She offered him a cup. "Force is the weapon of the fool," she told him. "Cronos is ruled by his appetite. He swallowed your kin because he could not control his hunger for power. We will use that hunger against him. We will not break him from the outside. We will break him from the inside." She went into the meadows by the ocean and gathered herbs. She picked dark, bitter roots. She mixed salt from the deep sea. She crushed seeds of mustard and plants that the earth grew only for purging. She brewed a pharmacon, a potion that was both a poison and a cure. It was an emetic of violent potency. "This will not kill him," Metis explained, holding up a vial of dark, swirling liquid. "He is deathless, but it will make him reject what he is not meant to hold. It will make the stomach of the king revolt against its own greed." Now, the plan required a delivery system. Zeus could not simply walk up to the throne. Cronos would recognize the aura of a rival. Here, the myths diverge in their details, but the most compelling narrative, the one that fits the tragedy of the family, involves the mother. Rhea was the key. She was the only one who could get close to the king. Zeus returned to his mother not as a babe, but as a conspirator. Rhea took the potion. She took the young god, perhaps disguised as a cupbearer, or perhaps she acted alone while Zeus waited in the shadows, and she returned to the gloomy heights of Mount Othrys. It was a time of feasting. The golden men were celebrating the endless harvest. The tables of the Titans were groaning with nectar and ambrosia. Cronos sat at the head of the table, the undisputed master. He felt heavy, yes. The stone he had swallowed sat in his gut like a lead weight, and the 5 children squirmed occasionally in his subconscious, but he was content. He was safe. Rhea approached him. She carried a golden goblet, filled with the richest, sweetest nectar. But mixed into the honeyed drink was the dark brew of Metis. "Drink, my lord," Rhea said, her voice smooth, masking the thunder in her heart. "A toast to your reign. A toast to the order you have kept." Cronos looked at her. He saw the submission he expected. He did not see the treachery. He was thirsty. The stagnation of his world had made him complacent. He took the cup. He raised it to his lips. He drained it in a single, massive draught. He wiped his mouth. He waited for the warmth of the nectar. Instead, he felt a fire. It began in the pit of his stomach, a cramping, twisting pain that made the Titan gasp. It was as if he had swallowed a ball of hot coals. The emetic worked instantly, attacking the divine biology of the god. The pharmacon clashed with the immortal ichor in his veins. His face turned pale, then green. The sweat broke out on his forehead, the first time a god had sweated in the Golden Age. The room fell silent. The other Titans, Oceanus, Hyperion, Iapetus, watched in horror as their king clutched his belly and groaned. The mountain itself seemed to shake with his nausea. Cronos stood up, staggering. He tried to speak, to command the pain to stop, but his throat seized. A convulsion of tectonic force rippled through his massive frame. He doubled over. And then the purge began. The first thing to come up was the last thing that went down. The stone. With a sound like a cracking glacier, Cronos vomited forth the omphalos. The great boulder, wrapped in the tattered remains of the swaddling clothes, flew from his mouth. It struck the earth with such force that it would later be carried to Delphi and set up as the center of the world, the navel of the earth. But in that moment, it was just a wet, slimy rock, the symbol of his foolishness lying on the banquet floor. Cronos stared at it, his eyes bulging. A stone. He had eaten a stone. Before he could process the betrayal, the second wave hit him. The emetic was relentless. It demanded everything. Next came Poseidon. The god of the sea erupted from his father's throat, slick with bile, but fully grown and howling with rage. He hit the floor and instantly expanded to his full size, shaking the slime from his blue hair, his eyes blazing with the memories of his dark confinement. Then came Hades. The lord of the dead slid out, silent and grim, shadow clinging to him like a second skin. He stood up, blinking in the dim light of the hall, his presence cooling the air. Then Hera, the queen, radiant and furious, her dignity offended, but her power unbroken. Then Demeter, the mother of grain, gasping for air, reaching out for the solid earth. And finally, Hestia, the first and the last. The eldest daughter, who had been in the dark the longest, emerged with a quiet grace, bringing the sanctity of the hearth back into the light. The 6 children of Cronos stood in the hall of Othrys. They were covered in the fluids of their father, but they were unharmed. They were united, and they were angry. Cronos looked at them. He wiped the sickness from his beard. He saw the stone. He saw the 5 gods he thought he had digested, and he saw the 6th, Zeus, stepping out from the shadows, his disguise gone, his body glowing with the promise of violence. The realization hit Cronos harder than the adamant sickle. The prophecy. It had not been stopped. It had been incubated. He had been the carrier of his own destruction. For a moment, the 2 generations stared at each other. The Titans, the old guard of the heavy earth and sky, and the Olympians, the new gods of movement, justice, and civilization. Then, chaos erupted. Cronos roared, a sound of pure, humiliated rage. He reached for his sickle, but the sickness was still upon him. His limbs were weak. The element of surprise was total. "Fly!" Zeus commanded. He knew they could not win this fight yet. They were 6 against the might of all the Titans. They had no weapons. They had no fortress. The siblings fled. They leaped from the parapets of Othrys. Poseidon summoned a mist to hide them. Hades cloaked them in shadow. They abandoned the mountain of their father and crossed the great plain of Thessaly. They headed for the opposing peak, Mount Olympus. It was there, on the snowy, many-ridged peaks of Olympus, that they established their stronghold. They were free. They were together. But they were at war. The Titanomachy had begun. For 10 years, the war raged. It was a stalemate. The Titans held Othrys. The Olympians held Olympus. They hurled rocks at each other. They shook the earth. But neither side could gain the advantage. The Titans were brutally strong and experienced. The Olympians were agile and powerful, but they lacked the firepower to break the Titan line. Zeus sat on the highest peak of Olympus, brooding. He looked at his hands. He had strength. He had Metis's wisdom. But he did not have a weapon that matched the sickle of Cronos. He needed something that could shatter the adamant. Gaia, the grandmother, spoke to him again. The earth was tired of the war trampling her surface. She offered the final key to victory. "You have brothers," Gaia whispered in the wind. "Not just the ones you saved from the belly. You have uncles, the elder brothers of Cronos, the ones he betrayed, the Cyclopes and the 100-handers. They are rotting in Tartarus. Free them, and they will give you the means to win." Zeus understood. He had to go where even the sun refused to go. He had to go to the basement of the universe. He took his brothers, Poseidon and Hades. The 3 of them descended. They found a chasm in the earth, a vent that led down to the roots of reality. They climbed down for 9 days and 9 nights, falling past the roots of the mountains, past the sources of the rivers, into the misty gloom of Tartarus. The air here was thick and stale. It was a place of absolute despair, and standing before the great bronze gates of the prison was the jailer, Campe. She was a horror, a dragon woman with venom dripping from her lips, 50 heads of beasts growing from her waist, and wings that blotted out the faint phosphorescence of the underworld. She held a whip of vipers. She was the final test of Zeus's worthiness. Zeus did not hesitate. He did not use a trick this time. He used pure, unadulterated divine violence. He lunged at the monster. Campe struck with her whip, but Zeus was faster. He dodged the vipers. He struck her with his fists, with stones, with the sheer force of his will. It was a brawl in the dark. But Zeus was the new king. He tore the whip from her hands. He struck her down. The monster fell, her many heads silencing one by one. Zeus stood before the bronze gates. He unlocked them. The doors groaned open, disturbing the dust of ages, and from the darkness emerged the prisoners. The Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, Arges. They were huge, hunched, with skin like leather, and a single eye that glowed like a forge fire in the center of their foreheads. They blinked at their nephew. They had been waiting for eons. They remembered the betrayal of Cronos, and behind them, the Hecaton Chiras, Cottus, Briareus, Gyges, mountains of muscle with 100 arms twitching with potential energy. "I am Zeus," the young god declared. "I have killed your jailer. I offer you the light. I offer you revenge against the brother who locked you here. Will you fight with me?" The Cyclopes looked at each other. They were smiths. They expressed their gratitude not with words, but with craft. They told Zeus to wait. They set up a forge right there in the underworld. They used the heat of the earth's core. They took the brightness of the light, the roar of the sound, and the violence of the impact. They hammered. The sound of their work echoed through the cosmos, a rhythmic clung, clung, clung that made Cronos on Othrys tremble without knowing why. They forged 3 gifts. For Hades, the unseen, they forged a helmet, the helm of darkness. Whoever wore it became invisible, imperceptible, a shadow among shadows. It was the weapon of terror and stealth. For Poseidon, the earth shaker, they forged a trident, a 3-pronged spear made of adamant and gold. With it, he could shatter rocks, summon earthquakes, and stir the ocean into a fury. It was the weapon of catastrophe. And for Zeus, for the savior, they forged the master weapon. They took the abstract concept of the storm and beat it into a solid form. They forged the thunderbolt. It was not a metal spear. It was a bundle of jagged, blinding energy. It hummed with the power of 1,000,000 volts. It was hot enough to melt stone and bright enough to blind the sun. It was the ultimate sanction, the Cronos. Brontes, thunder, gave it the sound. Steropes, lightning, gave it the flash. Arges, brightness, gave it the searing heat. They presented it to Zeus. Zeus took the thunderbolt in his hand. He felt the circuit close. The static charge that had been with him since the cave in Crete suddenly found its focus. His hair stood on end. His eyes glowed white. He was no longer just a challenger. He was the lord of the sky. He raised the bolt. The light illuminated the darkest corners of Tartarus, banishing the gloom of eons. "Now," Zeus said, his voice crackling with electricity, "now we go to war." They ascended, the 3 brothers, the 3 Cyclopes, and the 300 handers. An army of 12, rising from the pit to confront the lords of the Golden Age. On Mount Othrys, Cronos stood on the battlements. He looked south. He saw the darkness of the underworld opening. He saw a light rising, a light that was not the sun, not the moon, but something sharper, faster, and more deadly. He gripped his sickle, but his hands were shaking. The nausea of the emetic had passed, but a new sickness had taken its place. The sickness of fear. The storm was gathering. The winds were howling, and for the first time in the history of the cosmos, the sky was about to strike the earth with fire. The peace of the Golden Age was shattered, not by a whisper, but by a roar that lasted for a decade. The war that erupted between Mount Othrys and Mount Olympus was not a conflict of armies as we understand them. It was not a matter of strategy, supply lines, or territory. It was a collision of fundamental forces. It was the past fighting the future. It was the heavy earth fighting the kinetic sky. Cronos stood on the ramparts of Othrys. For the first time in eons, he looked old. Not in body. His flesh remained the unyielding adamant of the Titans, but in spirit. The paranoia that had been a cold, quiet companion for centuries had now manifested as a tangible enemy. He looked across the great Thessalian plain, the vast expanse of land that separated the two mountain ranges. In the distance, shrouded in storm clouds of unearthly violet and black, stood Olympus. He could see them, the usurpers, the children he had swallowed, now disgorged and burning with the fury of the imprisoned. He saw Poseidon shaking the earth with his trident, cracking the very foundations of the battlefield. He saw Hades, moving like a cloud of ink, sowing terror in the hearts of the Titan allies. And above them all, standing on the highest peak, he saw Zeus. The boy who had tricked him with a stone was now a man holding a weapon that made the sun look pale. The war settled into a grinding, devastating stalemate. For 10 full years, 10 great years of the gods, they fought. The Titans possessed immense physical strength and the solidity of the earth. They tore up oak trees by the roots and used them as clubs. They ripped boulders from the mountainsides and hurled them across the plains. They were the immovable objects. The Olympians, however, were the irresistible forces. They were faster, sharper, and filled with the desperate energy of revolution. But they could not break the Titan line. Cronos was too strong. His brothers, Hyperion, the Lord of Light, Iapetus, the Piercer, Coeus, the Axis of the North, formed a phalanx of divine power that seemed unbreakable. They stood shoulder to shoulder on Othrys, a wall of flesh and armor that repelled every lightning bolt and every earthquake. The earth suffered. Gaia, the mother of all, groaned under the footsteps of her warring children. The forests burned, the rivers boiled. The beautiful, bountiful garden of the Golden Age was trampled into mud and ash. The Golden Men, the gentle race that Cronos had curated, fled into the deep caves or perished in the crossfire, their peaceful existence erased by the violence of their masters. Cronos fought with a grim determination. He wielded the adamant sickle, slashing through the air, cutting the lightning, deflecting the trident. He told himself that he was the order. He was the pillar. If he fell, the universe would unravel into chaos. He fought not just for his throne, but for the preservation of reality as he understood it. He believed that Zeus was an agent of anarchy, a storm that would destroy everything. But Zeus had the one thing Cronos lacked: the ability to escalate. The turning point came when Zeus returned from the underworld with his new allies. The reinforcements had arrived. The weapon of the Cyclopes was in his hand, and the monsters of the Hecatoncheires were at his back. The final day of the war began with a silence that was more terrifying than the noise. The wind died. The birds stopped singing. The air grew heavy with static, the hair on the arms of the Titans standing up. On Othrys, Cronos felt a vibration in the soles of his feet. It was deep, rhythmic, and getting louder. It was the marching of the 100-handers. Zeus gave the signal. He offered the nectar and ambrosia to his allies, fueling them with the food of the gods, restoring their strength after eons of imprisonment. "Show them," Zeus commanded, "what gratitude looks like. Show them the anger of the earth." Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges stepped onto the front lines. They were nightmares made flesh. Each one had 50 heads that roared, barked, and hissed. Each one had 100 arms, thick with muscle, twitching with the need to destroy. They did not use swords. They used the mountain itself. With a coordinated scream that shattered the eardrums of the world, the 100-handers leaned down. They dug their 300 hands into the rocky cliffs of Olympus. They ripped massive stones, rocks the size of houses, the size of hills, from the bedrock, and they threw them. Imagine the sky turning black, not with clouds, but with stone. 300 boulders, flying through the air simultaneously, creating a literal rain of granite. Then another 300, and another. The Hecatoncheires were living catapults, maintaining a rate of fire that defied physics. The rocks smashed into the Titan lines on Othrys. They shattered the battlements. They crushed the armor of the gods. The Titans, who had stood firm for 10 years, suddenly found themselves buried under a bombardment of geological proportions. They raised their shields, but the sheer weight of the assault drove them to their knees. The sun was blotted out. The air was filled with dust and the smell of pulverized flint. Cronos roared, slashing at the falling rocks with his sickle, but for every stone he deflected, 10 more struck his fortress. He looked up, trying to see the enemy through the dust, and then the sky opened. Zeus decided that the time for restraint was over. He no longer held back his strength. The text of the Theogony is specific here. Zeus no longer held back his might, but straightway his heart was filled with fury, and he showed forth all his strength. He left the peak of Olympus. He did not walk. He descended like a meteor. He threw the lightning, not one bolt, not two, but a continuous stream of white-hot destruction. The bolts flew from his hand faster than thought. They struck Othrys with a heat that had never been felt since the birth of the stars. The effect was cataclysmic. The fertile earth caught fire. The vast woodlands crackled and burned. The fire did not just stay on the surface. It penetrated the soil. The land boiled. The text tells us that the breath of the fire reached the dark clouds. The hot vapor lapped around the earth-born Titans. An unspeakable glare blinded their eyes, immortal though they were. Cronos stood in the center of the inferno. He felt the heat melting his armor. He felt the air turn into plasma. He looked at his adamant sickle, the symbol of his power, the tool that had severed the sky, and saw it glowing cherry red in the heat. The ocean boiled. The streams turned to steam. The very chaos of the void seemed to open up, as if the universe was tearing itself apart. Hesiod writes that it sounded as if the broad earth and the high heaven were colliding, as if the sky was falling to crush the earth. That was the sound of the battle. The winds, seized by the power of the thunderbolt, began to spin. They became hurricanes, picking up the dust, the thunder, the lightning, and the screams of the Titans, mixing them into a vortex of destruction. Cronos fell back. He was blinded by the light of his sun. He was deafened by the roar of the hecaton shears. He was burning. The psychological weight of the moment crushed him. This was the sun he had feared. This was the prophecy made manifest. It was not a stealthy assassination in the night. It was an annihilation by light. Zeus was not just defeating him. He was erasing his era. The stagnation was being burned away by pure kinetic energy. The hecaton shears, seeing the Titans falter, charged across the plain. They moved with a terrifying speed for being so large. They climbed the slopes of Othrys, ignoring the fire. They reached the Titan line. It was a brawl of monsters and gods. Briareus grabbed a Titan, perhaps Hyperion, with 50 hands, pinning his arms, his legs, his head, while the other 50 hands pummeled him. The Titans fought back, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of limbs, by the chaos of the multi-limbed assault. Cronos found himself face to face with his destiny. The battlements of Othrys were crumbling. His brothers were falling. He stood alone amidst the ruins of his golden age. He looked up. Through the smoke and the blinding glare, he saw Zeus hovering above him, the master bolt raised for the final strike. The eyes of the father met the eyes of the son. In Cronos' eyes, there was the ancient, cold obsidian of the earth. In Zeus's eyes, there was the blue-white fire of the new order. "The cycle ends," Zeus might have said, his voice the sound of thunder. "The cycle never ends," Cronos might have thought, gripping his melting sickle. "It only turns." Zeus threw the bolt. It struck the ground at Cronos' feet. The mountain shattered. The ground gave way. The impact was so powerful that it did not just break the rock. It opened a hole in the world. The Titans were knocked off their feet. They were blasted by the shockwave. They tumbled down the slopes of Othrys, broken, burned, and defeated. The hecaton shears were upon them instantly. They did not kill them, for you cannot kill a Titan, but they bound them. They had brought chains. Great, heavy chains of unbreakable bronze, forged in the same dark smithy as the thunderbolt. They wrapped the chains around the wrists and ankles of the Titans. They bound the proud Iapetus. They bound the radiant Hyperion. They bound the strong Coeus. And they bound the king. Cronos felt the cold metal against his burned skin. He felt his hands, the hands that had ruled the cosmos, being pulled behind his back. The sickle was taken from him. It lay on the ground, cooling, a useless piece of metal in the ash. He was forced to his knees. The king of the world was kneeling in the dust of his own fortress. The war was over. The 10 years of thunder had ended. But the punishment was just beginning. Zeus did not intend to imprison them on a mountaintop or in a cave. He remembered where his uncles had been kept. He remembered the dark, misty pit that Cronos had used as a garbage dump for the ugly children of Gaia. Justice, in the Greek mind, is often poetic. It is a balancing of the scales. Cronos had used Tartarus as a weapon. Now, Tartarus would be his home. The Hecatonchires grabbed the chains. They dragged the Titans to the edge of the chasm that the thunderbolt had opened. "Down," Zeus commanded. The fall would take 9 days and 9 nights. Cronos looked one last time at the sky that was now the domain of his son. He looked at the earth that was now the domain of the Olympians. He saw the smoke rising from the battlefield, the end of his golden age. He did not beg. He was a Titan. He set his jaw, he closed his eyes, and he was cast down. The Titans fell. They plummeted through the crust of the earth, past the roots of the mountains, past the underground rivers, down into the dank, moldy, misty gloom of Tartarus. They hit the bottom of the universe, and there, the Hecatonchires were waiting for them. The brothers of Cronos, the ones he had betrayed, were now his jailers. They slammed the bronze gates shut. They piled stones against them. Poseidon fixed the gates with walls of bronze that ran around the pit. Cronos was in the dark again. It was a darkness deeper than the womb of Gaia, deeper than the stomach where he had kept his children. It was the darkness of irrelevance. He was no longer the king. He was a prisoner. The silence returned, but it was not the silence of control. It was the silence of the grave. On Olympus, the air cleared. The smoke drifted away. The sun, the real sun, Helios, the son of Hyperion who had chosen the new order, shone down on a scarred but liberated world. Zeus stood on the peak. He held the thunderbolt, now quiet in his hand. He looked at his brothers and sisters. They were battered, tired, but free. They had won. But as the dust settled, a question remained. What happens to a fallen king? Does he stay in the dark forever? Or does the mythology offer a strange, final twist to the tale of the Harvest Lord? The reign of Cronos was over. But the legend of the Golden Age would haunt the memory of man forever. And in the mysteries of the ancients, even Tartarus might not be the final resting place for the crooked counselor. The storm had passed. Now came the reckoning, and the slow, melancholic transition from history into myth. The fall lasted for 9 days and 9 nights. Consider the physics of that descent. Hesiod, in his attempt to map the terrifying geography of the cosmos, gives us an image of sheer verticality. He says that a bronze anvil, falling from the sky, would take 9 days to reach the earth, and that same anvil, falling from the earth, would take another 9 days to reach Tartarus. Cronos, the king who had once held the heavens in his grip, became that anvil. He fell through the crust of the world he had ruled. He fell past the roots of the mountains, past the subterranean rivers of fire and lamentation, past the very bedrock of reality. He fell into the dark. When he finally struck the bottom, the impact did not shatter him, for he was deathless, but it shattered his spirit. He lay in the gloom of Tartarus, a place so deep that it is described as being as far beneath Hades as the earth is beneath the sky. It is a dank, moldy pit, surrounded by a fence of bronze and wrapped in 3 layers of night. The Hecatonchires, his brothers, and now his jailers, locked the gates. They piled stones against the entrance. They stood guard, their 300 hands folded across their chests, their 50 heads watching the darkness. The irony was absolute. Cronos had once imprisoned them because they were ugly and chaotic. Now they were the masters of his confinement, the living walls of his cell, for an age, or perhaps an eternity, for time has no meaning in the pit. Cronos sat in the silence. The atmosphere of Tartarus is not one of fire and brimstone, as later theological imaginations would paint hell. In the Greek mind, Tartarus was a place of sensory deprivation. It was damp. It was cold. It was the murky gloom. It was the basement of the universe where things are stored and forgotten. Cronos, the titan of the harvest, was now a seed buried too deep to ever sprout. He was stripped of his sickle. He was stripped of his title. He was stripped of the adoration of the golden men. He was left only with his memory. In the dark, he had time to think. He thought of Uranus and the curse of the sky. You will be overthrown. He thought of the golden age, that static, beautiful lie he had constructed. He thought of the stone he had swallowed and the children he had tried to digest. He realized, in the slow, grinding way that mountains realize the erosion of the wind, that his resistance to the flow of time had been his undoing. By trying to stop the cycle, he had only built the pressure that eventually caused the explosion. The other titans, Iapetus, Coeus, Creus, were there with him. They sat in the shadows, silent monuments to a lost era. They were the former gods. The world above had moved on. Zeus was building his palaces of gold and marble on Olympus. The seasons had begun to turn. Winter followed autumn. Spring followed winter. Men were born, they aged, they toiled, and they died. The messy, dynamic, tragic machinery of life was in full swing. But the story of Cronos does not end in the dark. Mythology is not a static text. It is a living organism that evolves with the people who tell it. For centuries, the Greeks told the story of the chained titan in the pit. It was a warning against tyranny, a justification for the rule of Zeus. But as the centuries passed, the Greek mind began to soften towards the old king. They began to miss the golden age. They looked at their own lives, lives of war, plague, and back-breaking labor, and they felt a nostalgia for the time when the earth gave its fruit freely. And so, the poets began to sing a new ending. It begins with a whisper of clemency. Pindar, the great lyric poet of the 5th century BC, tells us in his Olympian odes that Zeus, securely established on his throne, eventually felt the cooling of his rage. Zeus was not like his father. He did not fear the past. He had conquered it. And because he was secure, he could afford to be merciful. Or perhaps it was something deeper. Perhaps Zeus realized that without the foundation of the past, the present cannot stand. He realized that Cronos was not just a tyrant. He was the root. The myth tells us that Zeus released Cronos. Imagine the moment. The bronze gates of Tartarus, sealed for eons, creak open. The hecaton shires step aside. A shaft of light cuts through the triple-layered night. Cronos, old and bent, his eyes unaccustomed to the brilliance, steps out. He is not restored to the throne of the cosmos. That time is gone. The world belongs to the Olympians now, but he is not destroyed either. Zeus grants him a new kingdom, a kingdom that befits his nature as the lord of the golden age. He sends him to the ends of the earth, to the great stream of Oceanus, far beyond the pillars of Heracles, far beyond the maps of men. He sends him to the Elysian Pedion, the Elysian Fields, the Isles of the Blessed. This is the most hauntingly beautiful image in the entire Cronos cycle. The god who ate his children, the god who castrated his father, is transformed into the White King of Paradise. In the Isles of the Blessed, the winds of the ocean breathe deeply and sweetly. The flowers blaze with gold, some on land, some on radiant trees, and some fed by the water. There is no snow, no heavy storm, no rain. It is a preserved fragment of the Golden Age, a bubble of time that Cronos is allowed to keep. But he does not rule over the golden men of the past. He rules over the heroes, the souls of the just, the warriors who fought bravely, the men who kept their oaths, those who have passed judgment in the underworld 3 times and been found pure, are sent to this island. They live there, careless and free from toil, under the gentle scepter of Cronos. It is a redemption. The crooked counselor becomes the good king. The paranoia is gone, replaced by a melancholic wisdom. He sits on a throne of flowers, watching the heroes feast, perhaps listening to the songs of Orpheus. He is the guardian of the afterlife's highest reward. He has become the grandfather of the gods, honored, respected, but removed from the levers of power. This transformation speaks to a profound psychological truth. We demonize the past when we are fighting to break free from it. But once we have established our own identity, we can look back with compassion. We can honor the ancestors, even the flawed ones. We can acknowledge that the Golden Age was beautiful, even if it couldn't last. But the journey of Cronos continues even further, crossing the sea of mythology into another culture entirely. When the Romans encountered the Greek myths, they looked at Cronos and saw something familiar. They saw their own ancient agricultural god, Saturnus. Saturn. The Roman retelling adds a layer of civilization to the raw elemental drama of the Greeks. In the Roman legends, after Zeus, Jupiter, usurped the throne, Saturn did not just fall into a pit. He fled. He became a refugee god. He traveled west, arriving in the untamed lands of Italy, specifically the region of Latium. The name Latium was said to come from the Latin word latere, to hide, because the god hid there from the wrath of his son. When Saturn arrived, the people of Italy were scattered and wild, living like beasts in the high mountains. Saturn gathered them together. He did not rule them with a sickle of blood. He ruled them with a sickle of harvest. He taught them agriculture. He taught them how to graft the vine, how to sow the grain, how to impose laws upon chaos. He brought the Golden Age to Italy, Aurea Secula. Under his reign, no walls were built, no wars were fought, and the soil was rich. He was the sower. He was the civilizer. The grim tyrant of Othrys became the benevolent grandfather of Rome. This duality, the terrifying devourer and the bountiful giver, was celebrated in the most famous festival of the ancient world, the Saturnalia. Held in December, during the darkest days of the year when the sun was weak and the earth was dead. The Saturnalia was a ritual attempt to bring back the golden age of Cronos/Saturn. For a week, the iron laws of Rome were suspended. The courts were closed. War could not be declared, and the social order was inverted. Slaves wore the caps of freedom. Masters served the food to their servants. Gambling was permitted. The strict, buttoned-up discipline of the Roman citizen was dissolved in a carnival of wine, candles, and gifts. It was a time of Io Saturnalia, a shout of joyous chaos. Why? Why did the Romans celebrate the devourer with such joy? Because they understood that Cronos represents the necessary chaos of renewal. He is the harvest god, and the harvest is a double-edged sword. To have the grain, you must cut the stalk. To have the wine, you must crush the grape. To have the new year, the old year must die. Cronos is the god of the cut. He cut the sky to create the world. He was cut down to create the Olympian age. He cuts the time to create the seasons. Even in the Greek world, his festival, the Chronia, was a time of dissolving boundaries. It was a harvest festival where slaves and masters dined together, a momentary return to the time before hierarchy, before the iron age of toil. So where does this leave us? Where is Cronos now? If you look at the night sky, you will see the planet that bears his name, Saturn. It is the slow-moving giant, the guard of the threshold. It is ringed, bound by bands of dust and ice, just as the god was bound by chains. In astrology, Saturn is the taskmaster, the planet of limitation, discipline, and time. He is the great malefic, but he is also the teacher of hard lessons. He is the pressure that turns coal into diamond. But if we look at the myth through the lens of the Hearths of Myths, we see a figure of immense tragedy and majesty. Cronos is the archetype of the father who cannot let go. He is the king who loves his kingdom so much he tries to swallow it to keep it safe. He is the embodiment of the resistance to change. We all have a little of Cronos in us. We all have moments where we wish time would stop. We all have golden ages in our past, childhoods, relationships, eras that we look back on with a longing to freeze them, to preserve them in amber. But the lesson of Cronos is that time cannot be eaten. The stone will always be regurgitated. The child will always grow. The future will always arrive. Yet, in his final resting place on the Isles of the Blessed, Cronos teaches us a second lesson: acceptance. After the war, after the pain, after the loss of power, there is a place of peace. The old king sits by the ocean, the white foam of his father's blood washing against the shores of his paradise. He watches the heroes come home. He watches the sun set, not with fear of the dark, but with the knowledge that the sun will rise again for someone else. He has become the keeper of memory. He is the deep, rich soil from which the bright flowers of Olympus grow. The storm of Zeus may rule the sky, flashing and loud, but Cronos is the bedrock. He is the gravity. He is the deep, slow rhythm of the eons. And so, as we close the book on the Age of Titans, we leave Cronos not in the dark pit of Tartarus, but in the golden light of an eternal afternoon, the sickle resting at his feet, no longer a weapon, but a tool of the harvest that has finally been gathered in. The winds of the world are quieting down now. The clash of the Curetes' shields has faded. The screams of the Titanomachy are just echoes in the mountain valleys. The air is cool. The hearth fire is burning low, casting long shadows on the walls. We have walked the full path, from the bloody rebellion of the sickle to the stagnation of the golden age, from the horror of the devouring to the trickery of the stone. from the chaos of the war to the peace of the Blessed Isles. We have seen the face of the Titan, and we have seen that it is in many ways the face of nature itself, cruel, bountiful, terrifying, and necessary. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the deepest roots of mythology. It has been a long road, winding through the darkness and the light. If you found value in this deep dive, if you felt the weight of the adamant and the warmth of the Elysian sun, please leave a like and subscribe to Hearths of Myths. We will continue to explore the ancient stories, to blow the dust off the old texts, and to find the human heart beating within the chest of the gods. Until next time, may your harvests be plentiful, may your winters be mild, and may you make peace with the passage of time. Sleep well.